Why doesn't Lindsay have to prove she wasn't criminally responsible? There's a legal rule in this case that initially made me stop. Because if someone says, I wasn't criminally responsible because I was suffering from a severe mental illness, my first instinct is, okay, then isn't that something the defense has to prove? And if you're coming from a jurisdiction where you're accustomed to thinking of insanity as an affirmative defense, you might have exactly the same reaction. But Massachusetts does something important here. The defendant does not have the burden of proving lack of criminal responsibility. The Commonwealth bears the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt not only that the defendant committed the crime, but that the defendant was criminally responsible for that conduct. And that distinction matters enormously in the Lindsay Clancy case, because Lindsay has pleaded not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility. Her defense is presenting evidence that she suffered from severe psychiatric illness, including the defense expert's opinion that she was experiencing postpartum psychosis. But the legal question isn't simply, did Lindsay have a mental illness? And it isn't, can Lindsay prove she was psychotic? The jury has to determine whether the Commonwealth has proved the required criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very different framework. And here's where I want to be careful, because I don't want this to turn this into a defense argument. The burden of proof doesn't tell us what the verdict should be. It tells us what the Commonwealth has to establish. And after 5 weeks of testimony, the Commonwealth has presented a very specific theory. The prosecution says Lindsay was mentally ill, but not so mentally impaired that she lost the capacity required for criminal responsibility. Its experts have challenged the defense's account of psychosis, particularly the reported male voice telling Lindsay to kill herself and her children. Dr. Gregory Sathoff testified that he believed Lindsay understood right from wrong and acted in a controlled and organized manner. He pointed to behavior that included going to a pediatrician, preparing lunch, and building a snowman on the day of the killings. And that's important, because the Commonwealth isn't necessarily asking the jury to believe Lindsay was perfectly mentally healthy. It's asking them to believe she was mentally ill, but she remained criminally responsible. That's a much more sophisticated argument. And I think that's one of the things the prosecution has done well. It hasn't had to deny every piece of the defense's psychiatric story. Instead, it can say, yes, there was an illness. Yes, there was suffering. Yes, there were psychiatric problems. But those facts don't necessarily establish lack of criminal responsibility. That distinction is going to be enormously important in closing arguments, because the defense has presented a powerful alternative explanation. Dr. Philip Resnick testified that Lindsay was frankly psychotic at the time, and that her actions were driven by hallucinations and delusions. So the jury essentially has two competing interpretations of the same person. Defense: she was profoundly psychotic and the killings were the product of the psychosis. Prosecution: she was genuinely mentally ill, but she understood what she was doing and remained capable of making deliberate choices. And now comes the difficult part. The jury doesn't get to decide this based on which expert do I like better. They have to evaluate the evidence, the behavior, the statements, the psychiatric history, the reported hallucinations, the medications, the planning, the sequence of events, the inconsistencies, the expert methodologies, and everything else presented over these 5 weeks. And then they have to ask, has the Commonwealth proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Lindsay was criminally responsible? That's a very different question from, has the defense proved that she was insane? And this is where I think some of the public discussion is going to get the case wrong. You may hear, well, she hasn't proved she was psychotic. That's not really the question. But you might also hear, she was psychotic, so she automatically isn't guilty. That's not the question either. The existence of mental illness doesn't automatically answer criminal responsibility. And evidence of organized behavior doesn't automatically answer it either. The jury has to determine what those facts mean. And here's where my own prediction comes back into the picture. I have told you I currently lean toward a guilty verdict. But I don't want us to get there by pretending the defense has nothing. It does. The defense has presented substantial psychiatric evidence, The prosecution has presented substantial evidence challenging the defense's interpretation, and now the jury has to decide whether the Commonwealth's interpretation is sufficiently established to satisfy the burden imposed by law. That is why tomorrow's closing arguments are going to matter so much, because the prosecution now has one final opportunity to take all of those individual pieces, the planning, the sequence, the reported voice, the inconsistencies, the organized behavior, the expert testimony, and turn them into one coherent argument. She was criminally responsible. And the defense has one final opportunity to take those same pieces and say, you cannot know beyond a reasonable doubt what was happening inside her mind at that moment, and the law doesn't permit you to guess. That's the battle. And that's why I don't think Grace and Gavel should ever be Team Lindsay or Team Prosecution. We're doing something harder. We're asking, what does the evidence actually prove? And has either side crossed the legal threshold? And tomorrow, when the lawyers give their closing arguments, that's exactly what I'm going to be listening for. Thank you for tuning in to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy. I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney. If you got value from this, definitely consider checking out Grace and Gavel and seeing some of our other content. And also consider liking and subscribing. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and hopefully you come back and see me again soon. Bye-bye.